the Bee Gees, an emblematic band of popular music of the 20th century and of our times. They achieved an extensive career. They started in the late 50s. Then, they were a psychedelic pop band with some hit singles in England during the 60s. Then, they had their worldwide consecration in the 70s, and an adult stage in the 80s and 90s with a lot of work. The soundtrack to the movie Saturday Night Fever knocked Fleetwood Mac off the charts to stay at the top for 6 months straight. They sold over 200 million records, just a few steps behind Elvis, the Beatles, Garth Brooks, and Michael Jackson. They are the only group in history to have written, recorded, and produced 6 consecutive #1 hits. Maurice Gibb once said, "We weren't on the charts, we were the charts." But overnight, America and the world decided that disco had gone out of fashion, and the Gibb brothers went from stardom to oblivion overnight. Of the 4 brothers, Andy, the youngest of the 4, had a successful career independent of the group, but thanks to excesses, he passed away in 1988, representing a vital blow in the band's history. Then, Maurice died in 2003. They stopped recording. Robin and Barry were too devastated to continue, and in 2012, after a long battle with cancer, Robin also departed, leaving Barry Gibb alone and devastated. Without 3 of his brothers, he was just waiting for the moment there was no more, in his own words. Today, we bring you the story of the most famous band in the world during the late 70s, the Bee Gees. Barry Gibb was born in 1946 in Douglas, a British Crown dependency of the United Kingdom. And 3 years later, in 1949, the twins, Robin and Maurice Gibb, were born, 38 minutes apart. Pushed by their father, they began singing as a trio at school, with Robin specializing in the lyrics and Barry emphasizing the melodies. They began at a very early age to sing in the theaters of Manchester. At the same time, in 1958, their new brother, Andy, was born, who took over the rank of the young brother while the brothers began to flourish musically. In the same year, the Gibb family migrated to Australia, where they continued their career with performances in theaters and other venues. At first, they were called the Rattlesnakes, then became Wee Johnny Hayes and the Blue Cats, until a radio station DJ named Bill Gates noticed a curious fact while eating with the Gibb family in Australia. It turned out that they all had too many letters, B and G, around them. There are so many that I can't think of another name. You should call them the Bee Gees. In the 60s, the band was already beginning to perform on television. Several Australian artists were amazed by Barry's ability to compose songs. Their debut singles, New York Mining Disaster, 1941, confused the radio stations, as it had a white cover. They thought they were the Beatles. Later they released To Love Somebody, which reached number 20.
To love somebody the way I love you.
Afterwards, the single Holiday was released in the United States and reached number 16. This single also came from their first album titled Bee Gees First, which reached number 7 and 8 in North America and the United Kingdom. But despite all their success, the group always had trouble gaining the respect of the industry. For example, there's a night that Barry Gibb remembers clearly. He was in a nightclub, where in the same place at the corner table was Pete Townshend, Jimi Hendrix, the Beatles, and the Stones. Then, Townshend turned to Gibb and said, "Do you want to meet John Lennon?" Excited, he said yes, and Pete walked towards him. When they arrived, he said, "John, this is Barry Gibb of the Bee Gees." And John Lennon, without turning to see him, said, "How you doing?" Then he stretched his arm back and shook his hand, and that was it. "That's how I met John Lennon's back," Gibb said with a smile years later. "I've never met him from the front." With the band formed by the 3 brothers, Vince Maloney on lead guitar and Colin Peterson on drums, they began work on the second album. Horizontal repeated the success of the previous album, reaching number 1 in the United Kingdom and playing live gigs in television shows such as The Ed Sullivan Show. "The best time of our lives was the time just before fame. We couldn't have been closer," said Barry Gibb. After the successes in 1969, the trio split in a dispute related to the album Odessa, a lushly orchestrated double album. It was their most ambitious recording up to that time, but they couldn't agree on almost anything, and so Robin left the band. He went solo and had a brief success in Europe with an album and a hit single. On the other side, Barry and Maurice continued under the name The Bee Gees, even calling on their sister Leslie to appear with them on stage. In those months, the supporting members of the band left, and Robin returned at the end of 1970 to consolidate the Bee Gees completely. They reached the number 3 position with the song Lonely Days, and had their first number 1 with How Can You Mend a Broken Heart. Then, the talent of the trio was also included in the soundtrack in the 1971 film Melody, and in 1972, they reached the number 16 position with Run to Me. Then came 4 more albums that put the band into an intermediate status. Barry said they were in the pop desert, but when Children of the World arrived, Barry found his falsetto, the discovery of $1 million, his characteristic and most important stamp. Accompanied by Blue Weaver's synthesizer, the music started to sound like disco. Led by the single You Should Be Dancing, the Bee Gees leapt to a different level of fame. In the words of Barry Gibb, after the Vietnam War, everybody wanted to dance. The soundtrack to Saturday Night Fever sold 15 million copies and won a Grammy for Album of the Year. The songs were amazingly popular in that period. The Bee Gees' youngest brother, Andy, followed his oldest brothers in the music career, enjoying considerable success. Produced by Barry, Andy Gibb's first 3 singles reached number 1 in the US charts. So huge was the wave of success the band was riding. What came after Saturday Night Fever on the part of the Bee Gees was the album Spirits Having Flown, which produced 3 more number 1 singles, Too Much Heaven, Love You Inside Out, and Tragedy. The Bee Gees' success seemed to be unchecked after their boom disco music fell, and so did the band's bubble. By the end of 1979, disco music was declining in popularity, and the backlash against the genre sent the Bee Gees' American career into a tailspin. Radio stations all over the US began promoting the Bee Gees Free Weekend. With their incredible takeoff from 1975 to 1979, the level of decline for the band was too steep. By the 80s in the US, the Bee Gees were practically invisible. Instead, Barry Gibb continued working as a producer for other artists, and in 1987 with the album ESP, their sales had recovered everywhere except in the US. They were number 1 with You Win Again, and by the end of the decade, his album, One, was well received around the world, and generated a top 10 in the US that it hadn't had since 1979.
Andy Gibb, youngest of the singing Bee Gees family, died early today.
On March 10, 1988, the youngest brother of the family, Andy, died at the age of 30 as a result of myocarditis. For Barry Gibb, it is still the most painful loss, the saddest moment of his life. Even to this day, he feels guilty for pushing Andy into show business. It would have been better to find something else. He was a sweet person, and we lost him too young, said Gibb in a 2018 interview. With High Civilization came the top 5 single, Secret Love, and after a European tour, Barry Gibb began fighting a serious back problem. He required surgery, and Maurice was also fighting a serious alcohol problem. And while fighting the problem, his father also passed away. In 1993, they released the album Size Isn't Everything, which also had another hit single. 4 years later, they released the album Still Waters, which sold over 4 million copies worldwide and debuted at number 11 in the US. Alone, the first single from this album gave them another top 5 in the UK and a top 30 in the US. At the end of 1997, the Bee Gees performed in a live concert in Las Vegas, Nevada, titled One Night Only. The spectacular and well-remembered concert sold close to 5 million copies as album and video. It took them onto a world concert tour of the same name. This added to their 1997 induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which caused a resurgence of interest in the band and closed the decade with what would be their last big concert in 1999. In 2001, they would release what would become the last album of the band, This Is Where I Came In. It gave each member of the band the opportunity to write in their own style, and also to compose songs between the 3 of them together.
Good evening. The music industry and fans around the world are mourning the loss of Bee Gee Maurice Gibb.
In 2003, Maurice died of a heart attack at the age of 53. He died suddenly. The surviving brothers announced that they would try to continue under the name of the Bee Gees, but with the passage of time, they decided to retire the name of the group, leaving it only to represent the 3 brothers together. The same week that Maurice died, Magnet, Robin's solo album, was released. Their legacy was beginning to be more and more visible to the younger generation. And making an exception in 2009 and early 2010, Barry and Robin performed on various television shows under the name of the Bee Gees. And in March 2010, they also inducted the famous Swedish group ABBA into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
The pop music world has lost another giant figure. Robin Gibb of the Bee Gees died Sunday.
On April 14, 2012, Robin Gibb lost a long battle with cancer, and with his death, the group ended their musical career forever. During September and October 2013, Barry Gibb made his first solo tour of the United Kingdom, in which he played the group's greatest hits. But as the years went by, depression attacked Barry a little. The only thing I regret is that in the end, we weren't good friends. There was always an argument in some way. Andy went to Los Angeles because he wanted to do it alone. Maurice had left, and we didn't get along very well. Robin and I worked musically, but we never did otherwise. We were brothers, but we weren't really friends. A few more good times would have been wonderful, said Barry Gibb 4 years ago. Today, in his twilight years, Gibb is surrounded by ghosts, his own past. In his house, there are pictures everywhere of his parents, his siblings, and deceased friends like Michael Jackson. I still consider myself a teenager. I keep the bathroom mirror dark to imagine myself as a child and not see myself as I am now. In an interview to Rolling Stones a few months ago, Barry Gibb says he thinks a lot about death, but he's not afraid of it. He always says that his live performances are counted and retirement is something he sees every day much closer. The Bee Gees, one of the great enigmas of popular music, successful and unjustly ridiculed, sold records by the millions like few others. For a while they were forgotten, but today the nostalgia of modern culture has given them a new rebirth and a respect that perhaps before they did not have at all. A group that was the biggest band in the world, and then they fell and everybody left, leaving Barry alone. I hope you like the history of the Bee Gees. Comment which are your favorite songs, subscribe, and this is Music Box.